The morning sun barely peeked through the tall buildings of downtown Chicago, casting long shadows across the busy streets. Among the rushing crowds, a woman in her early 30s stood quietly at her usual spot near the subway entrance. Her dark hair was neatly tied back, and despite her worn clothes, there was an undeniable grace in her posture. Beside her, a small girl of about 6 sat on a blanket, carefully coloring in a second-hand book with stubby crayons. The woman's eyes constantly moved between her daughter and the passing crowds, studying each face that walked by. She hadn't always been here. Just 3 months ago, they had a small apartment, a regular life. But life has a way of taking unexpected turns, and one misfortune had led to another. First came the layoffs at the restaurant where she worked, then the medical bills, and finally the eviction notice they couldn't fight. "Mama, I'm hungry," the little girl whispered, looking up from her coloring book. The woman's heart tightened. She reached into their old backpack and pulled out half a sandwich, their last piece of food from the shelter's morning provisions. "Here, sweetie, eat slowly, okay?" As her daughter ate, the woman cleared her throat quietly. She had been saving her voice all morning for this moment when the lunch crowd would start flowing through the streets. Music had always been her passion. She had even studied it in college before life took a different path. Now it was their only way to survive. The first notes of Amazing Grace floated through the air, her voice clear and pure against the city's chaos. A few heads turned. Her voice had that rare quality that made people stop, even if just for a moment, in their hurried lives. She didn't sing like a street performer. She sang like someone who belonged on a stage. Some passers-by dropped coins or small bills into the old hat in front of her. Others hurried past, avoiding eye contact. But she kept singing, one song after another, her voice never wavering. Each coin meant another meal, each bill another chance to keep her daughter warm and fed. A businessman paused longer than usual, listening to her rendition of Bridge Over Troubled Water. He reached for his wallet, then hesitated, looking at the little girl. Instead of money, he pulled out a business card. "There's a shelter 3 blocks from here," he said kindly. "They have a program for mothers. Maybe they can help." The woman took the card with grateful hands, tucking it safely away. As the afternoon wore on, her throat grew tired, but she couldn't stop yet. Their small collection of coins and bills wouldn't be enough for both dinner and saving towards a room for the night. Every dollar meant a choice between immediate needs and the dream of something more stable. Her daughter had fallen asleep on the blanket, the coloring book still open beside her. The woman gently stroked her child's hair, gathering strength for another song. In moments like these, when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, she reminded herself why she was here. Every note she sang was a promise to her daughter, a promise that this was temporary, that they would find their way back. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink above the city skyline. The evening crowd would be coming soon. People heading home from work, maybe feeling generous after a long day. She took a sip of water from their shared bottle and began to sing again, her voice carrying hope into the growing darkness. Little did she know, as the city lights began to flicker on, that fate was about to take another unexpected turn, this time perhaps in their favor. But for now, she sang, her voice telling their story to anyone who would listen, one song at a time. The autumn wind whipped through the city streets, carrying fallen leaves and the promise of an early winter. The mother noticed her daughter shivering despite wearing all the layers they owned. The little girl's usual bright eyes looked glassy, and her small hand felt too warm when she reached for her mother's sleeve. "Mama, my head hurts," the child whispered, leaning against their shared backpack. The mother's heart raced as she pressed her hand against her daughter's forehead. The skin burned beneath her touch, and panic rose in her throat. They had already used the last of their children's medicine 2 weeks ago when a cold had swept through the shelter. Looking at their day's earnings spread out on the blanket, she counted just enough for either a meal or basic medicine, but not both. The nearby pharmacy's lights glowed like a beacon in the growing darkness, its windows advertising cold and flu remedies that might as well have been behind fortress walls. The mother gathered her daughter close, trying to shield her from the bitter wind that tunneled between the skyscrapers. "Try to rest, sweetheart," she said softly, adjusting their thin blanket around the little girl's shoulders. But rest wouldn't bring down a fever, and she knew it. Making a decision, she began to sing, even though her voice was already raw from a full day of performances. The evening crowd was thinner now, but she had noticed over the months that people tended to be more generous when heading home. Perhaps it reminded them of their own families waiting for them. Her voice carried the notes of amazing grace into the darkening sky, but this time there was something different in the way she sang. Desperation mixed with determination gave her voice a depth that hadn't been there before. People who usually hurried past began to slow their steps. A young woman in scrubs stopped, listening for a full minute before dropping some bills in the hat. "Your little one doesn't look well," she said kindly, kneeling down to look at the child. "There's a free clinic about 10 blocks from here. They're open late on Thursdays." She scribbled the address on a receipt and handed it over before disappearing into the evening crowd. The mother sang on, her voice growing stronger with each song despite her exhaustion. A businessman who regularly passed by noticed the difference in her performance. Instead of his usual nod, he stopped and reached for his wallet. "I've heard you sing here for weeks," he said, placing a $20 bill in the hat. "But never like this. Whatever you're singing for tonight, I hope you get it." As the night grew colder, more people stopped to listen. An elderly couple shared their takeout dinner. A teenager pulled off her own scarf and wrapped it around the little girl. A food truck vendor closing for the night brought over hot tea in paper cups. Each small kindness gave the mother strength to continue, even as worry gnawed at her heart. Her daughter's fever seemed to rise with the moon, now high above the city lights. The little girl drifted in and out of sleep, sometimes mumbling words that didn't make sense. The mother's songs took on an almost prayer-like quality, each note carrying her fear and hope into the night air. She had nearly lost her voice when she decided to try one last song, Ave Maria. It was the most challenging piece in her repertoire, one she usually saved for special occasions. But tonight felt different. As the first pure notes rose above the street noise, even the traffic seemed to quiet. Unknown to her, a luxury car had just turned onto their street, its driver about to become an unexpected answer to her musical prayers. But in this moment, the mother simply sang, pouring everything she had into the ancient melody. Her voice soared above the city streets, carrying with it the universal story of a parent's love and sacrifice. The black Mercedes glided silently through the evening traffic, its driver lost in thoughts about board meetings and contract negotiations. The man behind the wheel had built his record label from nothing, turning a small studio in his garage into one of the industry's most respected companies. But lately, something had been missing, that spark, that raw talent that had drawn him to music in the first place. As he approached the intersection, the first notes of Ave Maria drifted through his slightly opened window. He almost missed it in the cacophony of city noise, but something in the voice made him ease off the accelerator. The purity of the tone, the depth of the motion, it wasn't the polished perfection he heard in his studios every day. This was something else entirely. He pulled over, leaving his hazard lights blinking. Through his tinted windows, he watched the scene unfold before him. A woman singing her heart out on a street corner, a small child huddled beside her. The contrast between the magnificent voice and their humble circumstances struck him deeply. The woman's eyes were closed as she sang, one hand resting protectively on her sleeping daughter's shoulder. Even from a distance, he could see the child's flushed face and restless movements. The mother's voice carried years of classical training, yet there was something more. A raw emotion that no amount of training could create. He stepped out of his car, forgetting about his expensive suit and the evening's dinner reservations. A small crowd had gathered, equally mesmerized by the performance. As the final notes of Ave Maria faded into the night air, the woman opened her eyes, and for a moment she seemed surprised by her audience. "That was extraordinary," he said, stepping forward. "I haven't heard a voice like yours in years." He noticed how she instinctively pulled her daughter closer, protective yet dignified. The little girl stirred, coughing weakly. "Thank you," she replied softly, her voice hoarse from hours of singing. "We're just trying to get by." She reached for a water bottle, taking a small sip before offering it to her daughter. "I own a record label," he said, keeping his distance to not appear threatening. "Would you mind singing one more song? Any song you choose." He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, but also a flicker of something else, pride, perhaps, or hope. She nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. When she began to sing Bridge Over Troubled Water, The crowd grew larger. People stopped recording with their phones and simply listened. The man who had heard thousands of auditions found himself holding his breath. Her voice had that rare quality that made time stand still. Halfway through the song, her daughter began to cry softly, burning with fever. The mother's voice never wavered, but tears rolled down her cheeks as she sang. It was this moment, this perfect blend of talent and raw humanity, that moved the record label owner to action. As the song ended, he stepped forward again, this time reaching for his business card. "Your daughter needs medical attention," he said gently. "Let me help." No strings attached. He saw the hesitation in her eyes, the natural distrust of a mother who had learned the hard way that nothing comes without a price. "I'm not asking you to decide anything about your future right now," he continued, noticing how she shivered in the cold. "But I have a doctor who makes house calls for our artists. Let me at least arrange that for your daughter. We can talk about your incredible talent after she's feeling better." The woman looked at her daughter, then at the small pile of coins and bills in her hat, barely enough for basic medicine, let alone a doctor's visit. Sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes pride needs to bow to necessity. The city continued its endless symphony around them, car horns, distant sirens, the rumble of the subway below. But in this moment, on this ordinary street corner, two worlds had collided. The record label owner reached for his phone, already dialing his personal physician, while the mother gathered their few belongings with trembling hands. Sometimes the most extraordinary opportunities come disguised as ordinary moments. As the luxury car's door opened, offering shelter from the cold night air, neither the mother nor the record label owner knew they were about to change each other's lives forever. In the warmth of the private doctor's office, the mother sat beside her sleeping daughter, watching as the physician gently checked her temperature. The record label owner stood quietly by the door, observing the scene with genuine concern. The doctor's office, usually closed at this hour, had been opened specially for them. One phone call had made that possible. "The fever's coming down," the doctor said softly, adjusting the blanket around the little girl. "The medicine should help her rest through the night." He turned to write a prescription, his pen scratching quietly against the pad. Once the doctor stepped out to prepare the medication, the record label owner pulled up a chair. There was something about this woman that reminded him of his own past, a determination he recognized all too well. "Would you like to tell me your story?" he asked gently. "Not for publicity or contracts, just, I'd like to understand." She looked down at her hands, calloused from countless hours of carrying their belongings from place to place. "I studied at the music conservatory," she began quietly. "Full scholarship. I had dreams of performing at the opera house." A small smile crossed her face at the memory. Then life happened. The record label owner nodded, remembering his own early days. "I know something about life happening," he said. "I grew up in a neighborhood where dreams were considered a waste of time. My mother used to clean houses to pay for my piano lessons." The woman looked up, surprised by his openness. "How did you make it?" she asked, genuinely curious. Her daughter stirred slightly, and she automatically reached out to smooth her hair. "One person believed in me," he replied simply. "My high school music teacher. She saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself back then. Sometimes that's all it takes, one person who believes." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Your voice, it has that same quality my teacher heard in my playing, raw talent shaped by real life." The woman's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back quickly. "My daughter's father left when I told him I was pregnant," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to keep performing, to finish school. But then my mother got sick, and the medical bills." She trailed off, the story all too familiar in its tragedy. "The streets weren't my first choice," she added, a hint of pride in her voice. "I tried everything else first. Waitressing, cleaning houses, call centers. But when we lost our apartment," she looked at her daughter, "music was all I had left to give." The record label owner listened without interrupting. He'd heard thousands of stories in his career, but there was an authenticity here that touched him deeply. Through the window, the city lights twinkled like stars, a reminder of both dreams and harsh realities. "You know," he said after a moment, "I've been in this business for 30 years. I've heard voices trained by the best teachers in the world. But there's something different about yours. It's like you're not just singing the notes, You're living them. The woman managed a small smile. When you're singing for your child's next meal, every note matters, she said simply. The truth of her words hung in the air between them. The doctor returned with medication and instructions, breaking the moment. But something had shifted in the room. A connection had been formed, built on shared understanding of both struggle and passion for music. I'd like to help, the record label owner said as they prepared to leave. Not just with tonight, but really help. No exploitation, no tricks. A real chance. He saw the hesitation in her eyes. You don't have to decide now. Take some time, think about it. Let your daughter get better. He handed her a card with his personal number. I grew up believing that talent alone wasn't enough to make it in this world, he said. But I was wrong. Sometimes talent just needs a door to open, even just a little bit. Outside, his driver waited to take them to a hotel he'd arranged for the night. As they stepped out into the evening air, the city seemed different somehow, less hostile, more full of possibility. The woman held her sleeping daughter close, the precious medicine secure in her pocket, and for the first time in months, allowed herself to feel something she'd almost forgotten: hope. Morning sunlight streamed through the hotel room window, so different from the harsh awakenings they'd grown used to at the shelter. The little girl was sleeping peacefully now, her fever finally broken. Her mother sat in a comfortable chair nearby, turning the record label owner's business card over and over in her hands. The phone on the bedside table seemed to stare at her. The owner had said to take her time, but he'd also mentioned coming to the studio today if she felt ready. Her daughter stirred, opening her eyes with a clarity that had been missing during her fever. "Mama, where are we?" she asked, looking around the clean, warm room with wonder. The mother moved to sit on the bed, smoothing her daughter's hair. "We're somewhere safe, sweetie," she replied softly. "How are you feeling?" "Better." The little girl sat up, noticing the room service tray from their breakfast. "Can we stay here?" The question hung in the air, heavy with hope and fear. The mother took a deep breath, remembering the record label owner's words from the night before. Sometimes opportunities came disguised as risks. She reached for the phone, her hands trembling slightly as she dialed. After 2 rings, his warm voice answered. "I've been hoping you'd call," he said. "How's your daughter?" "Much better, thank you," she replied, watching her little girl examine the hotel room's television remote with fascination. "About your offer, I'd like to know more." "Of course," he said. "But first, I've arranged something. There's a children's daycare center near our studio, very reputable. I sent my own kids there. They have an opening for your daughter while you audition and work with our vocal coaches." Her throat tightened. The biggest obstacle, childcare, addressed before she could even mention it. That's very thoughtful," she managed. "We believe in supporting the whole artist," he explained. "Talent doesn't exist in a vacuum. Now, about the audition, it's not really an audition. You've already proven your talent. Think of it more as a chance to see how we can work together." An hour later, they stood in front of a beautiful brick building. The daycare center looked like something from a movie, with colorful artwork in the windows and the sound of children's laughter drifting out. A kind-faced woman greeted them at the door, immediately connecting with the little girl. "We have art class this morning," she said, kneeling to the child's level. "Would you like to paint something for your mom?" The little girl looked up questioningly, and her mother nodded encouragement. "I'll be back soon, sweetheart," she promised, hugging her daughter tightly. Watching her walk happily into the classroom was both heartbreaking and hopeful. The record company's car waited outside, ready to take her to the studio. As they drove through the city streets, she saw her usual singing spot, now occupied by another street performer. Just yesterday, that had been her life. The studio building rose before them, glass and steel reaching toward the sky. In the elevator, the record label owner noticed her nervous fidgeting. "Remember," he said gently, "you've sung in much harder circumstances than this." The studio itself was both intimidating and magical. Instruments filled one corner, and the walls were lined with gold and platinum records. A vocal coach waited by the piano, her smile genuine and welcoming. "Before we start," the owner said, "let's talk about arrangements. We're offering a 6-month development contract. Housing included." He slid a folder across the table. "Everything's spelled out here. Take it to any lawyer you choose for review. We'll cover the legal fees." She opened the folder with shaking hands, her eyes widening at the terms. It wasn't just a music contract, it was a chance at a real life, for both of them. Why, she asked suddenly, looking up, why go to all this trouble for a street performer? The owner smiled, remembering his own past. Because 30 years ago, someone took a chance on a kid from the wrong side of the tracks, said his rough edges made his music real. He gestured to the studio around them. Everything in life comes full circle. Sometimes we're the ones needing help, and sometimes we're the ones able to give it. She looked down at the contract again, then thought of her daughter happily painting in her new classroom. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is accept help when it's offered. Okay, she said quietly, then with more confidence. Okay, let's do this. The vocal coach moved to the piano, playing the opening notes of Ave Maria, the song that had changed everything just yesterday. But this time, when she began to sing, it wasn't from a place of desperation, it was from a place of hope. The weeks flew by in a whirlwind of vocal training, studio sessions, and new experiences. Their temporary apartment, provided by the record label, felt like a palace compared to the streets. Each morning, the mother would wake up still wondering if it was all a dream, but the soft bed and her daughter's peaceful breathing beside her confirmed it was real. Try it again, but this time, let the emotion flow naturally, the vocal coach suggested during one of their sessions. Remember how you sang on the streets, raw, honest, straight from the heart. They had been working for hours on a piece that would become her debut single. The mother closed her eyes, thinking back to those cold nights when every note carried her prayers for survival. The music began again, and this time, her voice soared with the same authenticity that had first caught the record label owner's attention. That's it, the coach exclaimed, her eyes shining. That's the magic we've been looking for. You don't need to sound perfect, you need to sound real. In the control room, the record label owner nodded in satisfaction. He'd been right about her talent, but what impressed him more was her dedication. Every day, she worked tirelessly to improve, never taking this opportunity for granted. Back at the apartment each evening, she would find her daughter eager to share stories from the daycare center. "Look, Mama," the little girl would say, proudly showing off her artwork or a new song she'd learned. The transformation in her child was just as remarkable. Gone was the constant worry in those young eyes, replaced by the sparkle of childhood that should have been there all along. One evening, as they walked home from the studio, they passed their old spot near the subway entrance. A young man was singing there now, his guitar case open for donations. The mother stopped, remembering countless days and nights spent in that very spot. Her daughter squeezed her hand. "Can we give him something, Mama?" the little girl asked. The mother smiled, reaching into her purse for some bills she could now spare. As she dropped them into the guitarist's case, their eyes met in understanding. He nodded in gratitude, and she saw in him what others had once seen in her: talent, hope, and determination. The studio sessions continued, each day bringing new challenges and triumphs. The mother learned to use recording equipment, to work with backing tracks, to adjust her classical training for more contemporary styles. But most importantly, she learned to believe in herself again. "Your voice has grown so much," the record label owner commented one day, "but it hasn't lost that special quality that made me stop my car that night." He played back her latest recording, a song she had helped write, inspired by their journey from the streets to the studio. The vocal coach had become more than just a teacher. She was now a friend who understood the unique challenges of balancing artistry with motherhood. "You know," she said during a break, "I've worked with many talented singers, but few have your story, your depth. That's something you can't teach." At home, the mother and daughter established new routines. Homework and bedtime stories replaced long nights of uncertainty. Their apartment slowly filled with small treasures, drawings on the refrigerator, books on the shelves, and a small keyboard where they would practice simple songs together. The little girl's health had flourished with proper care and nutrition. Her teacher at the daycare center remarked on her quick mind and creative spirit. "She has your musical talent," she told the mother. Yesterday, she taught the whole class a song she made up. One particularly meaningful moment came when they received their first official photos from the record label's photographer. Mother and daughter both dressed in new clothes, smiling with genuine joy. Looking at those photos, the mother couldn't help but cry, not from sadness or fear as she had so many times before, but from gratitude and hope. The record label owner kept his word about everything. When the mother expressed concern about managing her new income, he arranged for financial advisors to help her plan for their future. When she worried about her daughter's education, he connected them with a good local school. Remember, he said during one of their progress meetings, true transformation isn't just about changing how you sound, it's about changing how you see yourself. And from where I'm standing, you're doing both beautifully. As the weeks turned to months, the mother's voice grew stronger, her confidence steadier. The songs they recorded told stories of resilience, hope, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and child. But more than just music was being created in that studio. A new life was taking shape, note by note, day by day. The morning of her single's release dawned bright and clear. The mother sat in their cozy apartment, watching her daughter get ready for school, such a normal, precious moment that once seemed impossible. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from the record label. The song was climbing the online charts, radio stations were already requesting interviews. "Ready for school, sweetheart?" she asked, helping her daughter with her backpack. The little girl nodded excitedly, then paused by their small radio. "Can we listen to your song on the way, Mama?" she asked. Just then, as if by magic, the opening notes of her mother's single filled the room. They stood together, listening to the story of their journey transformed into music. The song was special, a blend of classical training and raw emotion, with lyrics that spoke of hope rising from despair. But what made it truly unique was its honesty. The mother hadn't hidden her past. Instead, she'd embraced it, using her story to touch others. At the record label office later that day, the owner shared the overwhelming response. "Your video has gone viral," he explained, showing her the millions of views. "But it's not just the music people are connecting with, it's your story." The comments section was filled with messages from people sharing their own struggles, their own dreams. Single parents, struggling artists, people who had faced homelessness, all finding hope in her journey. "We've been getting calls," the owner continued, "from organizations working with homeless families and struggling musicians. They want to know if you'd be interested in working with them." The mother thought back to those cold nights on the street, how a simple business card had changed everything. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I want to help. But I want to do more than just perform. I want to create something lasting." Over the next few weeks, as her song continued to climb the charts, she worked with the record label to establish a foundation. Its mission was simple: to provide support for talented musicians facing hardship, especially those with children. The foundation's first project was a partnership with local shelters, providing music education and instruments to residents. The mother insisted on including childcare support. She knew firsthand how crucial that was for parent artists. Her daughter thrived in their new life but never forgot their past. One day, after they'd helped serve meals at their old shelter, the little girl said something that brought tears to her mother's eyes. "We're helping people like we used to be, right, Mama? Because everyone deserves a chance to sing their song." The record label owner watched their foundation grow with pride. "You know," he told her during the opening of their first music education center, "when I stopped my car that night, I thought I was just helping one talented singer. I never imagined it would lead to all this." The mother's story spread further, inspiring others in the industry. Other record labels began looking beyond traditional venues for talent. Music schools started scholarship programs for homeless youth. The ripple effect continued to grow. One year after that fateful night on the street corner, the mother stood on a real stage, performing for a packed auditorium. In the front row sat her daughter, beaming with pride. Next to her was the record label owner who'd taken a chance on a street performer, and beside him were families from their foundation's programs. As she sang the final notes of Ave Maria, the song that had changed everything, she looked out at the audience. There were tears in many eyes, including her own. But these weren't tears of sadness or desperation like before. They were tears of joy, of hope, of possibilities realized. After the performance, in the quiet of their home, mother and daughter sat at their piano. The little girl was learning to play now, her small fingers picking out melodies. "Mama," she said thoughtfully, "do you think there are other people like us out there? Who just need someone to listen?" The mother hugged her daughter close. "Yes, sweetheart, there are. And that's why we'll keep singing, keep helping, keep sharing our story. because sometimes all it takes is one person to stop and listen, one moment to change everything. Their story had come full circle, from a desperate song on a street corner to a movement helping others find their voice. But perhaps the biggest transformation wasn't in their circumstances, but in their hearts, knowing that no matter what happened, they would always use their blessing to bless others. The next morning, they walked past their old street corner on their way to school. Another musician was there, singing with hope in her voice. The mother and daughter stopped to listen, dropped some money in the hat, and shared a knowing smile. The music played on, carrying new dreams into the morning air.